The Deathworlders, a story by Hambone. Chapter 6, Taking Back the Sky. 1 year and 7 months after the Vancouver attack. One broadcast.
Awe, respect, statement. The Alpha of Alphas is here.
Another broadcast.
Anticipation, glee, eagerness. The first human meet to the Alpha of Alpha's maw.
The Alpha of Alpha's broadcast.
The quarry is dangerous. Remain focused.
Chastened, the brood guard fell into line respectfully around and behind the Alpha of Alphas as it emerged from its vessel. It stood nearly a head taller than even the largest of the lesser Alphas, and had undergone yet more extensive cybernetic upgrades, bonding all manner of arcane technology, reputedly of its own design, into its own flesh. The result was a mountain of metal and seething power, with 7 blinking eyes gazing balefully out at the world of prey around it, covering all the angles, never resting. Despite its size and bulk, the Alpha of Alphas moved in almost perfect stalking silence, a display of its long experience and skill as an apex predator. Without further communication, the Guardian brood followed their master as it pursued the most recent contact report. They paused as the lights flickered, and an instant later the deck heaved and rang to another impact, a stray shot from the battle in the void outside. The Dominion's vessels were selling themselves dearly, even self-destructing, rather than accept capture and the fate of all prey. But this was the first time the Swarm of Swarms had shown itself, and not even a third of it was committed to the battle. Most was still cloaked, on standby for the event that the Dominion forces should arrive. By the decree of Alphas, the hunters were yet to show their full strength. That third, however, was still many thousands of ships, and the defenders had either fled or were being swept aside in their suicidal bid to protect the station for as long as possible. The part inside found their quarry when a brood lesser tumbled into the corridor before them, crushed and broken, dead before it had stopped sliding. The Alpha of Alpha's broadcast.
Command, release the drones.
They did so. A swarm of insect-sized devices that would record what happened next, and inject the footage directly onto the prey's data networks. This, they knew, would prove to the prey beyond any doubt whom they should most be fearing. The microdrone zipped up and out, retreating to the corners and ceiling of the room the dead hunter had been thrown from, and then the Alpha of Alphas stalked through the door. Caleb wouldn't admit it, but he was starting to get scared. The children were hiding in a storage locker behind him, and so far he'd kicked the ass of every white freak that had come for him, even 10 at a time, but he was tired, exhausted even. Punch-drunk from so many of those weak-ass ray guns, floating in a shaky sea of stale adrenaline, bleeding from his nose and ears, bruised over practically every inch of his body. Yet still he willed himself to stand up and face the next monster that came to challenge him. This one, unusually, came alone. It was larger than the others, and armor-plated. It did not, however, seem to be carrying one of those pulse guns. Caleb was no idiot. He wasn't about to assume that the monster was unarmed, and he doubted that he could have got past that armor when at his peak, let alone now. He could see the writing on the wall, and felt strangely at peace because of it. "Time to die, huh?" he asked the monster, which surprised him by growling a reply in English. It actually spoke the English, too. He could tell the difference.
"Yes, time to die. Eat to the
It said. "Fuck you," Caleb told it. He charged. The alien raised its arm, aimed at the ground in front of him, and fired once. He died. The Alpha of Alpha's broadcast.
Satisfaction. The builders are to be commended. These nerve jam grenade launchers work exactly as anticipated.
The servos of its powered exoskeleton whined as it picked up the dead human by the back of its neck. The quarry seemed even heavier in death. The coordination and balance that had kept it upright and agile during his life was gone now, replaced by a few lingering twitches as the last jolts of the nerve jam effect rampaged around that delicately optimized masterwork of a nervous system. All that was left was a mass of meat and bone as heavy as the Alpha of Alphas itself was, even in its exoskeleton, and a fraction of the size. No matter. The prize awaited. Its helmet dismantled itself, dissolving into a swarm of construction nanites that crawled back into their hive at the nape of the Alpha of Alpha's neck. It considered its limp prize for a second, and then opened its jaw as wide as they would go, bit into the human's throat with all the strength it could muster, and, with some effort, ripped free a mouthful. The meat was indescribable. Dense, lean, rich, full of that indefinable spark of sentience. It exceeded even the Alpha of Alpha's most extravagant fantasies.
Ecstasy. Meat to the maw.
The cry was taken up among the brood. It spread to the swarm, and from there to the swarm of swarms, and through them every hunter in the galaxy. The first great hunt had been successful. 2 years and 5 months after the Vancouver attack. Captain Riley Jackson. It was a good name, and she hoped that people would remember it, and for the right reasons. She hoped that she would be remembered for earning this mission on skill and merit, rather than being sneered at as a diplomatic bit of political correctness, given the job just because she was a black woman. It was a crazy mission. She'd gone to church, said her prayers, prepared herself as best she could. There was a non-zero chance that things could go horribly wrong, but all test pilots knew that. You just had to trust your sled. "Houston, Pandora. Final checklist complete," she intoned, her tone steadier than she felt. "Copy, Pandora. There's no window here, Riley, so just whenever you're ready for it." She knew that her flight operator down in Houston was probably just as scared as she was, but there was that voice, the calm and steady one that said everything, no matter how dramatic, with perfect clarity and confidence. She knew that even if she disintegrated in a few seconds, that professional tone would never crack. She could become a smear of plasma across half the heavens and add her name to the victims of humanity's odyssey, and that voice would coldly describe her demise as a malfunction. In its way, that was comforting. "Houston, Pandora, let's take back the sky." She allowed herself a small smile of triumph at not repeating Armstrong's mistake and choking on her big quote. Still congratulating herself, she pressed the button. 2 seconds, and 1,000,000,000 kilometers later, with a ferociously ecstatic whoop, Riley Jackson entered the history books as the first human being to outrun light. Jenkins' bar erupted. The entirety of the Scotch Creek base staff had crowded in to watch the moment when their 2 years of hard work had paid off. And paid off it had, in style. From Claude Nadeau's breakthroughs in electrostatic field emitters that allowed Pandora to fly on gargantuan weightless wings of pure force field and boost itself into space for a fraction of the expense required by a traditional rocket, to Ted Bartlett unraveling the secrets of space-time field distortion technology and inventing a distortion drive that actually worked on a reasonable budget of energy, without any awkward relativistic time dilation, and without ripping apart the sun in the process. General Tremblay smiled indulgently as the crowd of ecstatic scientists formed a circle with their arms around each other's shoulders and launched into a drunken, cacophonous rendition of "We Are the Champions." "Heck of a day." He turned to Kevin Jenkins, who had been the one to start the song on the bar's music system. He had fit into the bass perfectly, falling comfortably into his niche as the Scotch Creek Research Facility's resident purveyor of alcohol, caffeine, filling food, and televised sports matches. Probably 2/3 of the major breakthroughs at the base had taken place over coffee and bacon cheeseburgers at the bar's increasingly scuffed wooden tables. "Heck of a day," Tremblay agreed, trying to make it sound like his heart was in it. Jenkins just handed him another coffee, black, 2 sugars, with an expression that said he could see straight through the general's attempt at positivity. He was as bad as Dr. Sung sometimes. "Shitty time for a divorce, General," Jenkins said. Check that. Jenkins could be far, far worse than the doctor sometimes. He didn't have a professional's code of conduct stopping him from being blunt. How did you guess?" "Doesn't take a rocket surgeon," Jenkins told him. "You've been sitting there staring at your wedding band looking like you took a dump and found a kidney in the bowl." "Is there such a thing as a good time for a divorce?" Tremblay asked. Jenkins thought about it. "When you wake up in the morning after a night out on Vegas and there's a shaved orangutan in your bed?" Tremblay couldn't resist it. He laughed. Jenkins gave a satisfied nod. "How long were you married?" he asked. 10 years. Steven's a great guy, and I love him so much it hurts, but, he wanted me to retire and adopt a couple of kids with him. But then Rogers Arena, this base..." Tremblay sipped his coffee as he trailed off. "Life happens, man," Jenkins told him. "At least it's not boring. Be a whole lot worse if you were moping around at home lovesick and not knowing what to do with yourself." "True. At least I can focus on my work." Tremblay smiled at that, his first genuine smile of the day, as he looked at the big screen on the wall where Mission Control at Houston was just starting to settle down from its jubilation and get back to work. "And we did good today, didn't we?" "You did damn good, man," Jenkins said. "Sure, that kid Jackson's the name everyone will remember, but she'd never have got up there without you. Hell, it was you that persuaded the treaty members to unify their space programs. I guarantee that Pandora would have never been funded without that." Tremblay nodded and put his drink down. "Thanks, Kevin. I needed that." "Anytime, Martin." "She has been in there for 2 months now. We think she managed to tap into a water pipe, and from the smell she maybe even set up a dizzy rat farm in there, and she refuses to come out. Would you, when the galactic news is full of members of your species being thrown out of the airlock? Look, we weren't going to do that. We were just going to, evict her. Give her a little ship and some nutrient spheres and point her towards a nice Class 11 somewhere. She's from a Class 12, right? She should have no problem surviving there. Kirk issued the equivalent of a frustrated sigh. Like all Rrrkatukkatukcher, he was fond of his Viskatuk cousins, but they really were as dense as a bag of gold sometimes. I did some research on this one. She used to sell insurance before the Kortai took her. She used to sit in an office with a headset on talking to people over audio comms. On her days off, she used to fashion garments out of spun animal hair and went swimming in a heated, disinfected pool. She may be a native of a Class 12, but frankly, I think she might have starved to death on a Class 6, he said. A thought struck him and he chuckled. They abducted her on the way home from the pool, actually. Think she knows where her towel is? Her towel? Nobody ever... In-joke. Never mind. It was hard being a fan of human literature sometimes. Okay, well, I don't know how you're going to get her out of there. Nobody can fit in there except maybe for a Gowan or a Kortai, and even if they could, she's human. She broke a security officer's leg accidentally. Oh, it's okay. I think she just needs to see a friendly face. The Viskatuk security officer looked up as the door cycled to admit Maria, Amir, and Allison, the latter of whom flipped a jaunty mock salute to the stunned officer before she and Amir stooped slightly and presented their linked hands to boost Maria up into the open ventilation duct, below which Kirk and the officer had been conversing. A second later, Amir boosted Allison up into the vent as well, and then leaned against the wall and waited, watching the tall blue being with that unsettling binocular gaze that seemed to flicker all over him, taking in every detail. "You brought more?" "Several," Kirk said, secretly enjoying himself. "Don't worry, they've all got disease suppression implants." "But don't you know how dangerous?" "Who? Them or the hunters? They're nice people. A little strange, some of them, and I can't really tell if that's because of the isolation or if that's how they've always been. But trust me, every single one's as moral and good-natured a being as you could wish to meet. And the hunters don't have the first clue my little flying sanctuary exists. So far as we know. Besides, if this goes as well as it usually does, she'll be on board among her own kind and will be gone soon enough." "Sanctuary? You're keeping them safe?" Kirk nodded. "Somebody has to take care of the poor little monsters when the galaxy is losing its mind," he said. There was a scuffle from the vents, announcing Allison and Maria's return. Behind them was Abigail, the woman they had come to rescue. She dropped lightly to the deck in the, for her, light gravity, shot the officer a glare that wished it could be as deadly as the rest of her, and shook hands with Amir, who extended a friendly arm to invite her back to the ship. Kirk was secretly delighted to notice that she had a large beige towel draped over her shoulders. "See? Problem solved. Now you can put out the word that your station is a human-free zone and the great hunt will pass you by, He said it lightly, but there was an accusatory edge to the apparently benign observation. He regretted it when the officer wilted slightly, and reminded himself that it wasn't the poor young male's fault. He was just following orders, and a job not dissimilar to the one Kirk himself had held only a few years ago. On a whim, he decided to repair things and sent a small currency gift to the officer's personal network. "Here, get yourself some or something. My treat. You'll get in touch if any more humans show up." The officer offered a defeated gesture of assent. "Sure. Yes, I will." "Good. Thank you. It's been a pleasure." He swept from the room. Behind him, the pressure of sheer charm that he'd been keeping up the whole time slowly deflated, and the security officer recovered enough to glance at his personal funds, the ceiling vent, and the door. The ceiling vent and the door. "What the shirt?" he muttered. "Okay, I've seen some fast talking in my time, but you had that guy just swallowing every word you said within seconds of meeting him," Allison commented during the walk back to the sanctuary. "How'd you do that?" "Vizkatuk have an instinctive respect for the judgment and intelligence of my own species," Kirk explained. "All you have to do is keep talking in an amiable, I know everything about everything tone of voice, and they'll agree to sell you their sister if you keep it up long enough." "You're shitting me." "Exaggerating," Kirk allowed. "But they really do grow up with the idea that we're the smart ones. That builds a degree of innate respect and trust." The sanctuary had been modified yet again since the Hunter ultimatum, growing 3 rings of cabins that encircled the reactor, enough for 4 times its current population. Given that they were sized for the average species, they were huge by human standards. The beds large and luxurious, with plenty of room for floor exercises. Kirk had permanently set the gravity, temperature, and pressure on those decks to mimic sea level on Earth, and left the human passengers to their own devices. The ultimatum had made Kirk's job much easier. Ships, bases, and stations across the inhabited galaxy had scrambled to appease the Hunters, and the humans living aboard them had understandably reacted to protect themselves. Finding abductees was now as simple as following the requests for military support from the Dominion's naval forces. And, of course, the humans they found were more than happy to leave. Showing up with 3 friendly Homo sapiens and sharing the name of the ship seemed to be pretty much all it took now. The most time-consuming part was all the traveling. Still, in 2 years they had averaged slightly less than 1 new rescue a month. Too many times they had arrived to find the human they were chasing had already left. A few times they'd arrived to find their sought refugee had been gassed, or had their hidey hole depressurized. One station's overseer admitted that they had resorted to nerve jam, and Allison caught Maria's wrist just in time. If that grief-driven slap had connected, the station overseers still got an up-close and personal introduction to the wrong end of Allison's pistol, however, and a personal promise that there would be a reckoning someday. The whole ship had been in a subdued mood for several days after that incident. They'd held a wake, a kind of body funeral service. Kirk hadn't joined in. 22 humans throwing a party to help themselves feel alive in the face of futility and pointless death was more than even he could handle. 3 of the 22, 23 now, only rarely showed their faces, preferring to lurk up in the cabins and avoid him. The rest were happy to spend time in the large recreational area, playing games, watching movies, or just hanging out and talking. He was pretty sure there was a fair amount of sex going on in the cabins, too. Months or years of isolation without seeing others of their own kind had left many of the refugees with unresolved tensions that they were vigorously and gladly resolving. Kirk had first started researching human sexuality long ago when the observatory was first established. What he had found had initially disturbed him, and then later made him jealous. Among his own kind, the point of reproduction was reproduction. It brought emotional fulfillment and intellectual pleasure to carry out the act of continuing the species, and the act itself was reportedly pleasantly intimate and had some enjoyable sensations. Kirk didn't know firsthand, having fathered no children. For humans, however, the act itself seemed to bring intense physical pleasure, as well as considerable emotional satisfaction and positive social repercussions. Like everything the species did, there were conflicting norms and etiquettes everywhere. There was a stigma to having no sex and a stigma of having too much. There was a stigma to having never had sex and a stigma to having it prior to engaging in a legal bond partnership. There was a stigma to sex with members of the same sex, and the fact that this was even an option had been a major source of confusion for Kirk at first. And yet, most humans seemed to be to some extent inclined to bisexuality. Then there were gender identities, ones that correlated with the biological sexes, ones the direct opposite of them, and gender identities that had nothing to do with either of the available biological options at all. The whole thing was bewildering and strange, but also exciting, and made Kirk feel a little envious. He had long since realized that for all their physical impressiveness and mental agility, humans were still just as fragile as anybody else in their own ways. To learn that they had a whole type of pleasure available to them which Kirk would never be able to experience for himself felt a little unfair. He was wondering how it had helped them survive the conditions on Earth when his train of thought was interrupted by a call from the ship. He had left Lewis in charge of the ship's sensors and comms.
Kirk, man, we got some pretty big news, dude.
Lewis was interesting. They'd picked him up at a Cortai research facility on a barren planet that officially had no name, but which Lewis insisted was called Kerbin, on the grounds that he'd been the first to name it. Although he'd originally been taken there as a test subject, his escape had apparently consisted of amiably disabling the force field on his containment cell before letting himself into the lab to explore some avenues of research that his abductors hadn't even considered. He was the only one on the crew who'd needed persuading to leave, though it hadn't been a difficult negotiation. His objections had faded the instant he realized there were chicks aboard Sanctuary. Kirk hadn't yet managed to figure out if his speech pattern was due to the permanent influence of some Cortai experiment, or a lifetime of recreational narcotics, or if it was just an affectation. Whatever the explanation, it was clear that behind that dopey dude attitude was a mind to rival the very greatest alumni of the Cortai Directorate's education system. Strangely, he and Amir had become instant best friends. Kirk had no idea why. Share it.
News from Earth, dude. Looks like our guys just went, FTL for the first time ever.
Kirk came to a dead halt in the hallway, oblivious to the beings that were edging around the knot of 3 humans to get past him.
Kirk? Why are you smiling, man?
Oh, no reason. It's just nice when your friends impress you. Meeting is called to order in the chair and so on. Let's get on with this. How did they get FTL so quickly? The scribe scrambled to finish the block of formalities that were the usual preface to meetings of the Dominion Security Council, and then gave up in bewilderment as the representatives of 5 different species all tried to speak at once. While most of the remaining representatives just looked silent and glanced sideways at one another, one raised a huge hand and waited, radiating a patient pink. Councillor Vedrig, the chairman addressed him. You have an opinion?
I do.
The clamor died, and they turned to listen to him. He took a moment to gather his shawl of office around his upper shoulders and strike a suitable states-being-like posture before launching into his explanation.
We have reason to believe that a functioning wormhole beacon may have been smuggled to Earth during the early years of the observatory program. Despite having been moved outside of the barrier, the observatory still exists and has been monitoring space-time distortions around Earth and its near orbit. Among the many traces we found in the subcycles preceding the launch and test flight of this human craft were some that corresponded to the generation of experimental wormholes. Reverse engineering a working apparent linear velocity drive from the temporal stasis technology contained in Hunter assault pods would have yielded FTL technology ahead of schedule anyway, gentle beings. But when coupled with access to a working jump beacon...
The Ruaher delegate interrupted him at that.
Jump beacons are useless by themselves,
she pointed out.
For travel, maybe. For the purposes of learning the fundamentals of spatial distortion science, you could not ask for a better specimen technology,
Vedrick explained calmly. The Gowan delegate, a venerable male with long streaks of white around his eyes and muzzle, spoke up. Need I remind the Council that while the reforms to Dominion law concerning the status of intelligent non-FTL-capable species is still being negotiated, the law has always been clear that once a planetary civilization has successfully and safely caused one living member to travel faster than light, they are official sentients and must be afforded the full rights and protection of a provisional member, he said. I must repeat that it is the official stance of the clans of Gao that the quarantine field is a crime against the human race, and that it should be removed as soon as possible. There was a general equivalent of nodding and hear, hear. Vedrig's flanks flushed a complicated medley of reds and purples.
In a purely personal capacity, Father Vian, I agree, and I would like it on record that I voted against the proposal when it was first tabled in the Confederate Assembly,
he said.
I was outvoted, and it remains beyond my power to countermand that decision.
Kirk's replacement as the representative for the Vizcatic domain spoke up. But it is not beyond your species' power to ignore the founding charter, she retorted. The Confederacy is constitutionally obligated to remove that quarantine field. Vedrig clamped down on an emotional luminescence, allowing only a forthright gray shaded with firm dark orange to show.
You are correct, of course. However...
He trailed off, searching for the correct way to phrase his next explanation. The Kortai representative finally chimed in, deploying a careful, however, into the conversation at the precise moment it would do the most harm to his confidence.
However, the barrier cannot be removed,
Vedrick explained. It must be, asserted the Kortai representative calmly.
I do not mean that my government is officially unwilling to remove it, though that is in fact the case, but that we do not, in fact, have the ability to do so.
This was met with an incredulous silence that he rushed to fill.
Humanity have attracted the ire of the Hunters. FTL-capable sentients though they may now be, they lack the orbital defensive infrastructure to protect themselves from the swarm of swarms should it descend upon an unprotected Earth. The best guess of our xenopsychologists is that the Hunters are not afraid of humanity, but are instead jealous of them. The humans have, after all, attracted considerable attention and fear in recent cycles, and the best guesses we have into Hunter psychology is that they view it as imperative that they be feared. The existence of species which we, their prey, apparently fear even more than the Hunters themselves is a direct affront to them. So, dropping that barrier would result in the almost inevitable genocide of a species that, for all their physical and mental tenacity, could not hope to survive a sustained orbital barrage.
Again, the Kortai spoke up. A morally sound reason, he said, making the words morally sound carry the same weight of emotional opinion as he might have said financially questionable. So let us hear about your inability to remove the barrier. Your own experts designed it, did they not?
Indeed. To defend our own systems from external military threats. Converting one into a containment barrier was done hastily by the simple expedient of programming the emitter nexus to wrap itself up in its own field.
Surely it can be remotely deactivated.
You must understand, Counselor, This was a defensive tool. The risk that it might be hacked and disabled by an appropriately skilled communications expert would have been a military liability. The device does not communicate with other systems via anything other than a physical connection.
The Cortai nodded understanding, which is now impossible to establish thanks to the way it is contained within its own field. He sniffed his disdain. Rather an unfortunate oversight by your engineers. The sentiment was echoed around the table.
The Confederacy will make all appropriate reparations to the human race, of course,
Vedrig said hurriedly. A safe assertion, considering that they appear to be indefinitely contained, the Gowan said. The Mother Supreme of our clan of females will be notified of this, however. If you cannot make appropriate reparations to the human race, you can at least offer all necessary steps to compensate those humans who were stolen. Here the furred counselor shot a glare at the Cortai representative, which the latter being totally failed to acknowledge, from their homeworld and have taken up residency in the galaxy at large, and to those species and organizations that have taken it upon themselves to provide them with security and a place to live. Meaning Gao, I assume, the domain's representative noted, with all of a rare-ka-tuck-ka-tuck-chaz dry wit. Among others, the counselor agreed, defiantly. She was about to offer a sharp retort when Vedrig held up one enormous hand, flanks shaded to indicate resignation.
The Gowan representative speaks the truth. The Confederacy is thus obligated to compensate them.
He agreed, having spent several boring days reviewing the law and precedents that applied in this scenario, none of which had contained any help for the Confederacy.
What are the terms requested by the clans of Gao?
He asked. Food supplies, nutritional supplements and medical supplies necessary to support all humans who choose to accept sanctuary on our homeworld, plus appropriate military hardware and assistance to defend our planet from hunter retaliation, the counselor replied, having clearly memorized the terms in advance. An immediate cessation of the information blackout surrounding Earth and the establishment of diplomatic channels so that all stranded humans may directly contact their loved ones. Remunerative compensation to our people equivalent to 10,000 Dominion development credits per human refugee who settles on Gao for longer than 2 cycles, and a 5-cycle waiver on our obligation to commit units to the Kelsey conflict.
Those last 2 terms are unacceptable,
The Ruaher delegate objected, siding with the Governor-Ag Vendragon.
Excessive, certainly.
Vedrig agreed.
While the Governor-Ag have no grounds to appeal the first, second, and third terms, my people have the right to negotiate over the penultimate term, and that last one is a matter for the Security Council.
The chairman spoke. Then it is the ruling of this council that the Governor-Ag Vendragon Confederacy is to pay the clans of Gao, and to any other people or organization who harbor human refugees the following: food, nutritional supplements and medical supplies to provide for that human's needs, military assistance and or hardware sufficient to realistically defend them from hunter attacks. Furthermore, the Governor-Ag Vendragon Confederacy is required to permit ships to approach the Sol blockade and communicate with Earth, it said. The motions have also been tabled first that the Confederacy is to pay 10,000 Dominion development credits per human refugee to any species or organization which protects them, with the motion's opposition requesting negotiation of that amount. As many of each opinion, vote now. There were a few busy moments while each representative made their decision. The second motion is that the Gowan clans should be granted a 5-cycle waiver on military involvement in the Kelsey conflict, with the opposition denying that motion outright. As many of each opinion, vote now. Again, they voted. As to the first motion being the 4,303rd vote of this council, there were 2 votes in favor, 8 votes against, and 3 abstentions. The opposition has it, and the requested sum of credits will be renegotiated. The chairman sounded the little chime that ceremonially marked that a decision was complete. As to the second motion being the 4,304th vote of this council, there was 1 vote in favor, 12 votes against, no abstentions. The opposition have it, and the motion is defeated. The second chime was the signal for council scribes, aides, and messenger drones to zip about the place in a frenzy of activity. The chairman raised its ceremonial rod and spoke slightly louder above the noise. This council session will now recess until the next standard diurnal period, 2 years and 7 months after the Vancouver attack.
Civilian vessel, this is Confederacy Destroyer Vogarung Grovanek. Identify yourself and state your intentions.
Vagara Gravanek, this is Yacht Sanctuary requesting permission to approach the broadcast point.
Permission granted, Sanctuary. You are cleared for 1 burst transmission of no longer than 3 terabytes.
Acknowledged, Vagarung Governek. Thanks to the convenient relay offered by a Cortai communications monitoring station that had been installed 20 years previously, it was a trivial matter for the sanctuary to squirt a total of 25 videos towards Earth. 24 of them were from the human refugees, many of them tearful as they finally took the chance to relieve their loved ones' fears. The 25th was from Kirk. Kevin, I hope this finds you still alive and complaining. I know for a fact that you're well wrapped up in whatever's going on down there. You see, I knew about the jump beacon. The one you stole was trash, by the way, so I snuck a working replacement into your bag. Glad to see it worked as planned. Tell whoever you gave it to that if they tune it with the algorithm that's on screen right now, we can start sending some of these people home. Now, on to the really important stuff. If I know humans, you're probably already well on your way to dropping this barrier somehow. But take it from your old friend, for the time being, that would be a very, very bad idea. You see, a lot has happened up here since Vancouver.